The house had always felt a little off, though Maria and James never put much stock in that feeling. It was old, after all, with its creaky floors, drafty windows, and odd corners that never seemed to get enough light. They had bought it because it was a fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood, a place where they could settle down, start their lives together. Maria had always loved old houses, the charm, the history, but James wasn't so sure. It was during the renovations that they first discovered the room. They had hired contractors to knock down a wall in the basement, expanding the cramped space into something usable. The crew was halfway through when the foreman called them down to show them what they had found. Behind the wall, tucked away in the shadows, was a doorway. No, more like an archway, leading into a hidden room. The contractors were perplexed. There had been no sign of this on the original plans, and no reason for a room to be there. It wasn't particularly large, perhaps the size of a small bedroom, but it felt wrong, cold, as if the air itself was somehow thicker, heavier. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as they stepped inside. The room was empty, save for an old wooden table in the center and strange markings on the floor, faded but unmistakable, circling the table in a jagged, uneven pattern. "Looks like some kids were screwing around down here," one of the contractors said, though his voice lacked conviction. There was an air about the room that made even the most skeptical person hesitate. Maria, ever the curious one, crouched down to inspect the markings. They were symbols, ancient and alien, nothing she recognized, though they stirred something deep within her, something primal and uneasy. "James, I think this is something," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't need convincing. The room felt wrong. The contractors, clearly eager to be done with the discovery, suggested they seal it back up, no charge, and pretend it never existed. Maria and James agreed, but the decision didn't sit well with either of them. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. The images of the symbols danced behind her eyelids every time she closed them, swirling and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. She turned in bed, restless, only to find James already awake, staring at the ceiling. "Can't sleep?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "No, that room, it's bothering me." His voice was quiet, contemplative. "I keep thinking about those markings." Maria nodded in the darkness. They both knew it wasn't just a hidden room. There was something more, something lurking just out of sight, something they couldn't quite put into words. The next morning, they decided to go back down. The contractors had boarded up the entrance, but it wasn't anything they couldn't pry open. Armed with flashlights and a determination they couldn't explain, they descended into the basement. The door was as they had left it, sealed, untouched. But as they stood before it, Maria felt a strange pull, like something was calling to her. Her hand trembled as she reached for the boards, but before she could touch them, the air shifted. A sound, low and guttural, reverberated through the basement. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. James stiffened beside her. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Maria nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. It came from the room. They exchanged a glance, their curiosity battling with their growing sense of dread. But whatever had been awoken wasn't going to let them walk away. James grabbed a crowbar and began prying the boards loose, each creak of the wood sounding louder than it should have in the still air. When the last board fell away, they stood before the archway once more. The room seemed darker than before, as though the light from their flashlights couldn't quite penetrate the space. Maria hesitated at the threshold. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to seal the room and forget it existed, but something deep inside urged her forward. She stepped in, and the temperature dropped immediately. James followed, and as they stood in the center of the room, the air seemed to thrum with a quiet, malevolent energy. The table was still there, the markings still visible, But now there was something else, an object in the center of the table. It hadn't been there before, of that they were certain. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, dark and smooth to the touch. Maria reached out, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. "Wait," James said, grabbing her wrist. "We don't know what this is." But Maria was already lost in the pull of the box. She shook off his grip and lifted it, feeling a strange warmth emanating from it despite the coldness of the room. As she opened the lid, a gust of air whooshed through the basement, extinguishing their flashlights for a moment, plunging them into complete darkness. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Maria's shallow breaths. When the lights flickered back on, something had changed. The room felt more alive, more oppressive, as though it was watching them, waiting. Maria looked down at the box's contents and recoiled. Inside was a small, withered figure, a doll, but not like any doll she had ever seen. It was old, ancient, with eyes made of polished stone and limbs twisted unnaturally. Its body was covered in more of those strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. The markings on the floor seemed to shimmer, coming alive in the flashlight's beam. "We need to leave," James said, his voice tight with fear. Maria wanted to move, wanted to agree, but something held her in place, something in the room, something in the box. The doll's eyes seemed to gleam in the darkness, and for a moment, she thought she saw them shift, just slightly. Then, without warning, the air in the room grew thick, pressing in on them from all sides. A low, guttural sound filled the space, a voice, though it spoke in no language they could understand. The markings on the floor glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the sound, and Maria felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. James grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, but the room seemed to resist, the air growing heavier with each step. As they stumbled through the archway, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. They collapsed on the basement floor, gasping for breath, hearts pounding. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, they turned to look at the door. It was sealed once more, but the sense of unease lingered. Something had been awoken in that room, something ancient and malevolent, and it wasn't going to let them go so easily. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. They would hear faint whispers in the house, always just on the edge of perception. Shadows seemed to move on their own, flickering in the corners of their vision. Objects would go missing, only to reappear in odd places, as though something was toying with them. And always, there was the sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Maria began to have strange dreams, vivid and terrifying. She would see the room, the markings, the doll, but in her dreams, the doll wasn't still. It would move, its stone eyes following her, its twisted limbs reaching out. The whispers grew louder in her dreams, incomprehensible yet filled with malice. She woke each morning drenched in sweat, heart racing, unable to shake the feeling that the dream was more than just a nightmare. James, too, was affected. He grew distant, irritable, as though something was gnawing at him from within. He would sit in silence for hours, staring off into space, his face drawn and pale. "It's the room," Maria whispered one night as they lay in bed, both too afraid to sleep. "We never should have gone in there." James didn't respond, but she could see the fear in his eyes. They both knew it was true. The house was no longer just a house. It had become something else, something darker, something dangerous. Days turned into weeks, and the presence in the house grew stronger. Lights flickered on and off at random. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Maria could feel it watching them, waiting. She knew, deep down, that they had awoken something ancient in that forgotten room, something that had been lying dormant for centuries. And now it was free.